Greetings and welcome back. Today I'm going to be having, I think, a very important discussion about the topic of genetics, because genetics is a topic that is, you could say, very common these days. It's thrown about quite a bit, and I think there is a huge gap of information and knowledge as to what is actually going on, both in the field and in understanding the material. My guest today is a biologist who is specializing in the field of genetics, and the point of this really is to clarify and inform people who actually have an interest in understanding the real genetics, as it were, as opposed to the things that are sort of gossiped and talked about on the internet. So that said, thank you for joining me. You mentioned before I started recording this that the only really relevant field within biology these days is genetics. Maybe you could go into that a little bit before we get started talking about some of the details.
Sure. And what I mean by that is, like, my interest was in biology as I went into university. But what I was noticing is that in all of the coursework, it didn't matter what kind of subject you were studying within biology. You would see that the bleeding edge, the literature that they would have you going over, always relied primarily upon new methods that were being enabled by genetic technologies. And that seems to be the way the entire field is going. And so that's where my interest lied.
Yeah. I mean, and it makes sense because before any discovery of genetics, before really in the 19th century, well, even the early 20th century, I guess there was some speculation, all you really had was taxonomy and classification and I guess a kind of behavioral zoology as well. There was that. Mm-hmm. But there wasn't really, you couldn't really talk about anything as to building
medical
blocks
anatomy.
Anatomy, yeah, sure. But the building blocks of life, RNA, DNA, genes, these things were not really known about, so there's no way to have a discussion about them. All you really had was speculation. I mean, there was Darwin, of course, who had a tremendous contribution, but it makes sense that everything is these days in the field of biology is geared towards the study of genetics. So, speaking of RNA and DNA, these are things that are, of course, talked about frequently, and you could say thrown about frequently. But again, a lot of people don't really. I mean, we know a lot of people know what it stands for: deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. So let's talk about, I guess, to begin with, the similarities and differences in the functions of DNA and RNA, respectively.
Sure. So DNA and RNA are in some ways very similar. They're composed of similar things, both having 4 base nucleotides, but with RNA there's an important substitution of uracil with thymine. But they are interchangeable in the functional interchange between DNA and RNA, which goes both ways depending on where you're looking at the activity of either particle or molecule, I should say. These are functionally the same. The difference between the molecules, I would say, is to do with where in the information, either storing or acquisition process they lie. It's kind of a continuum. So for most life on Earth, as it stands today, DNA is the functional reservoir and not much else. It isn't autocatalytic like RNA is. It doesn't have a life all its own. It's managed, usually, if not in use, deactivated, stored, and tightly bunched up. Or, well, it gets more tightly bunched up if it needs to be transported. But what I'm talking about would be heterochromatin, which is like a less accessible form if it's not being used. And that's essentially what it is. I think of it like a hard drive or something that, it isn't really. It's mostly inert. And then RNA, in contrast, is only seen where it's active. So RNA would be like the expressed version of DNA in a eukaryotic cell, like what makes you up. And when it needs to become functional, translated, or even have activity all its own, it takes an RNA form. That's how you know it's on its way to doing things in the world.
Right, right. And the two, I mean, in terms of producing life, sort of need to work together.
That's correct.
Since RNA transfers things and DNA stores things, you can't really have one without the other and still get eukaryotes or multicellular life, right?
Right, right. I think that's kind of how I like to think about DNA. It's just kind of like a more refined version of RNA. So RNA is the first thing that you would need to exist, and RNA obviously is the the functional interface with DNA between that and proteins and the rest of the metabolism in the cell. You work your way up to DNA through processes involving RNA. So the two are inextricably linked.
Yep.
And what I mean by DNA being kind of like a more refined version of RNA is that eventually you'll have RNA, which is tied to the ability and need to replicate. So RNA is autocatalytic, like kind of a self-sufficient molecule. DNA is, in its properties similar to RNA in certain ways, but it's kind of been divorced from that like self-sufficiency. So I'm not saying every RNA particle can replicate itself, but the basis of the RNA that is functional in the world is like a self-replicating process, where DNA is like where that gets pared down to such a degree that it's just inert storage.
Yeah. I mean, do you get the sense, before we proceed, that most people on the internet who are talking about genes and genetics don't even have the faintest notion of things like this at all? As in, they don't have even the slightest basic understanding?
I think I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt, but as you investigate, I sadly find more and more that it is the case that people do not know these things or care to know them. They don't like to be correct.
I think you were there, must have been months ago now, for that one conversation where there wasn't even much, I don't think there was much discussion about the technical stuff, like going into the form and functions we're talking about now, but there was some guy who seemed to be struggling with the very notion of the heritable. That
That's
things,
correct.
Things
We discussed in particular his blue eyes and how he came to have them.
Yeah, and he just really couldn't get it. And eye inheritance, I've kind of looked into this, is a pretty complicated. It's actually a fairly complicated thing. I forgot how many. I think it's 18 different genes involved, but don't quote me on that. It might be even more or fewer. But it's not a simple thing. But the point is, it's heritable. Eye color is, well, everything's heritable potentially, but it's heritable, and he was struggling with that. But then you get other people who talk about, and this is a good way to kind of segue to the next topic of SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, because as everybody knows, there's been this huge rise in recent years in, I guess, DNA testing kits and testing your genes. And I think, in my own personal view, there's a lot that's deceptive about these things, because they're testing a very small component of your total genome.
That's right.
And all it's really telling you is that, the SNPs that we've identified seem to correlate with this or these populations. It might not even mean you're from that population, theoretically. It could just mean that there's a high correlation. It won't tell you very much about the person, and because they're not looking at your entire genome. So maybe we can get into SNPs now, and how populations are identified, what the limitations of that are, and really just what the implications of that might be.
Sure. So a single nucleotide polymorphism is essentially, and that's what SNP stands for, is one of the many actually things you might use in theory to identify like a person out of the population and where they might be in terms of their genomic content that's identical by descent. So everything in the interpretation of like a polymorphism, which what distinguishes that from a mutation would be its inheritance. So nothing here is divorced from the context of we're examining sexually reproducing species, like lines of inheritance. And what that means is, like, we care about this polymorphism because it exists in a certain number of people in the population, and it's not necessarily functional, although it might be. It's that it was inherited through this line of descent, and we can infer then, like looking back in a tree, like common ancestry. So what a lot of people don't really know, or there might be like an overly large focus upon SNPs as a source of this type of information, but really there are more than that. It's actually to do with the simplicity in detecting and kind of compiling SNP data. It has been the impetus for the rise of SNP-based testing, as opposed to other copy number variant-based testing. So there are other regions within the genome that you might also use to identify common ancestry, which would mark these things as well. But usually they're more sequentially like intensive. So you can have different resolutions within these variations within the data that go all the way down to the level of identifying parent and child. And I know that there are methods in the common test kits that also are used to identify these things, but I'm talking about stuff within the DNA that would be used in like a crime lab, for example. And then all the way back to stuff that has even less resolution that's more relevant on the species scale. And the different types of variation, and we could go through a few of these, but it's not really going to be relevant until it's relevant within what's going to be possible cheaply with computing. But there are other forms, and we will see them used, I think, increasingly.
So okay, so that's you can say the specifics. It seems to basically be a question of it's just easier to use SNPs, the SNP method, as opposed to others. One thing I've observed is that a lot of this obsession and the rise of these gene testing services has a lot to do with this. For lack of a better way of describing this obsession that people have these days and in recent decades with race and ethnicity, and how the more that's grown, and maybe it's this kind of symbiotic relationship of sorts, the more you get these tests, and people get the tests, and I think they read too much into the results oftentimes than is actually merited. I don't know what your own view on this is, but I do think there's oftentimes a political angle.
I think of that's actually, it's really interesting, because you'll see people getting I won't get into examples, but there are people who are very interested in like what exact percentage they are of a certain ancestry. And I doubt that these people, tying into what you said earlier about like how naive people are about genetics, they seem to think it's like if he's 96%, then that's more desirable than somebody else's 95. And really, it couldn't be further from the truth. Like, it has nothing to say about where these, what functional regions, or if any functional regions, may be tied to the ancestry that they're looking for. And it also doesn't tell you whether or not, if we were to use like a higher resolution, higher computational method, that you might find the same amount of ancestry. It's just within the given methodology. And none of it is perfect. None of the inheritance that you'd see in an SNP is entirely estranged from like strange occurrences. So like an SNP can be lost, and still the functional region beside it, which it's being used to measure by its proximity, it might also still be there. And the meaningfulness of this stuff is overstated vastly. Plus the underlying traits which are being inferred, while it may be a proxy for that information, giving the 95, 96, or what I said, 97 example, it doesn't really tell you whether or not the underlying functionality that you're inferring is also inherited along those lines.
Exactly, and I think this is something that drives me up the wall. People will, take some test, and they'll get some set of random percentages, and then they'll infer all kinds of things like, I don't know, trait X is expressed more commonly in this population, therefore I have it. But that, again, whilst there's probably could be overlap with the average, at the end of the day, you're not the average, you're you, and so you need to, ideally, you'd want to decipher your entire genome. But there's also that sort of political impetus behind it of sort of deciphering your DNA. The other thing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think the the reach of time in terms of testing autosomal DNA is fairly limited. I think it goes back maybe 300-400 years, and beyond that, it's kind of lost to time as its direct ancestry. That's what I'm saying.
Well, you would need the particles. And we don't really have too many of those, like going back further than 400 years that we could, reliably test or, know for sure to be, authentic and maintained.
Yeah. And so the thing that's really I've noticed, and it occurs both on the left and in certain circles to the right, is just taking DNA results and using them as a proxy for
purity.
Sorry?
For ideological purity?
Yeah, ideological purity, inference of traits that may or may not be there, correlations that may or not be there. It's not... I mean, it's interesting in the same sense that I'd say looking into haplogroups is interesting. That's something you can get from these. But that's more of, for me at least, it's more of a sort of historical interest, I guess, or prehistorical interest in terms of haplogroups. I don't, getting your quote-unquote DNA results doesn't really, at least the incomplete results you get from some of these services, doesn't really tell you all that much. And I've noticed a few things that they can tell you from limited information have always been extremely mundane. So things I've known for years that I could have inferred. For example, my hair fell out when I was 23. Oh, and then so I read on the health things that you're likely to. Oh, there you go. I read that I had light eyes. Oh, I could have inferred that. I know that. I read that I'm.
It's kind of a neat party trick, though.
Yeah, and I read that I'm, to use the modern term, not particularly melanated. Now, wow, I didn't know that. None of these. I didn't learn anything I didn't already know. Whereas I'm pretty sure as the technology improves, and we can get into that, if getting full genome decoding would tell me potentially a lot more. But it is a neat party trick. It's great for political ideologues, both on the left and the right. I mean, on the left, it's if you can, I guess you do the same thing in Canada. If you're a Afro-Irish, Italian, First Nations Canadian, or you're, take your pick of whatever the groups, and you're a hyphenated American, that makes you special. And if you're in the right, specifically the alt-right, if you're 90% plus Northwestern European, you're chosen or something like that. It's so, and this is the problem. I don't think people are actually in the public doing much work to really explain this stuff in great detail. They're just sort of throwing these tests out, and that's pretty much it.
Like I said, we won't have the we won't have the best answers, or the answers that people are assuming to be there if we think the worst of them, or if we know them to be kind of dishonest with themselves about what this information might mean, if not misinformed. We won't have that until we've decoded the entirety of the genome. And what I mean by that is like the function of every single gene in like a practical sense. Mm-hmm. And then also there are regions of the genome thought to be useless, and controversially, like it's gone back and forth, but we know them to be structurally important, if nothing else. The genome can be used in more than one way. All life on Earth, most life on Earth uses DNA as its basis, but we know that if you try to do, like if you attempt transgenesis, that it's been, when you attempt transgenesis, you find out very quickly that different organisms are using their DNA in very different ways. And I don't think that we really have all of the answers that we would want before you could get something like an over-the-counter test to tell you everything you want to know about your genome. And pretending like we do know is obviously a hindrance to our further knowledge.
Yeah, a couple of points there. I'd argue that if you're a political ideologue, all you need to know or use is that specific bit of information that something like a 23 might offer you. I am very interested in, I don't know if you were referencing junk DNA, and I've tried to keep up with that. Please correct me if I'm wrong. My most recent encounter with reading up on the subject is that the view that junk DNA was function without function has been corrected, and that's not the case? Or maybe we could go into that a bit.
Yeah. So it turns out that in eukaryotic organisms, there's much to do with the actual expression of a gene. In something like a prokaryote, you would see far less inhibitory effects basically in place for keeping a gene from being expressed. In a eukaryote, there happens to be like a series of proteins more complicated than in a prokaryote that are needed for polymerase to originally bind to DNA to express a gene at all. And some of these structures that kind of form over the DNA also have to do with DNA folding onto itself. So you can have short stream and like a short upstream, downstream, or like long upstream, downstream, either structural or functional like aspects where there is like a binding point, say on a piece of DNA that doesn't ever get translated into mRNA, but serves as an anchoring point for like the superstructure that DNA is going to form to ultimately assemble like what you can think of as an assembly line for certain gene products. So, like, you know, what is and is not functional will vary on an organism to organism basis, but to assume that something that doesn't seem to be expressed, doesn't seem to code for anything is functionless is basically wrong.
Yeah, why do you think the earlier interpretation was why do you think they interpreted it that way earlier?
I think they interpreted it that way because it was all very new, and we thought that we would find all of the answers by sequencing the genome, and then we find out that we that we don't really know much at all about it. And rather than assume that there's all of these things that we still don't understand after investing enormous amounts, it was like the Human Genome Project was like a decade-spanning project costing endless billions. And what we came up with was that we didn't know a lot of things. I think there might just be a human impetus to say that what we don't know is unknowable or isn't anything at all.
Yeah. Do you think that the general thrust now has been more of caution than just rather than jumping the gun and making assumptions that may or may not be founded? Do you think moving forward that's the case?
I think moving forward, like, are we talking about like within the field or?
Well, because we'll get into gene technology in a bit, but yeah, that people are more cautious in making assumptions about the functions of certain elements of DNA and what have you.
Yes. A lot of tentative proposals about what X gene might do needs for further verification, of course.
Yeah, and this kind of segues somewhat nicely into genetic technology. You know, I don't want to, I'm not going to bring out a Kraut for no reason, but there was that whole, a lot of this kind of got started, I suppose, to find the gene. But the truth, before we get into genetic technology, correct me if I'm wrong, to actually, the difference between inferring heritability is vast from the difference of actually finding which genes are associated, correlated, and indeed cause certain traits, we'll say strongly correlated with certain traits, isolating them. And oftentimes, I would say that, would you say in the majority of the cases they're polygenic, that traits are polygenic in terms of heritability?
Well, it depends which trait, but almost certainly the ones we're discussing kind of tangentially here with Kraut would be polygenic.
Yeah. And so that you'd have to actually, to whatever technology you'll be using, you'd actually have to identify what genes do what. It's all well and good to infer things, and that there's a statistical metric that's valuable, but this seems to be the huge gap, and maybe we can get in a bit of that too.
In many cases, we have in genetics, when we're working with, for example, model organisms for which we have every single gene inside of their genome sequenced and like worked on by so many different eyes that we have, like, you can search a sequence in like GenBank, and what you'll get back is like the different homologs that we have within model organisms, and then like different like experiments that we've done with them, what we've inferred their function to be. And the further apart two organisms are, and depending upon the conserved nature of the region, you might find that there are variations with these things. They've accrued genetic mutations over the eons, but what you still tend to find is that a gene with one function tends to preserve a similar function, or a similar remain within a similar family of functions between organisms. And so, say if you don't know the exact function of a gene that's been basically implicated in like one correlation or another, you might be able to reasonably guess, if you not know, but guess what that gene might be responsible for. So it's not a shot in the dark. Not
no,
always.
but I mean we're about to I suppose get into CRISPR, because that's sort of the I wouldn't say the elephant in the room, but that seems to be the way forward in terms of genetic modification or editing specifically. Perhaps not in a shot in the dark, and we'll get in the details of what CRISPR is and how it works. But it's my understanding of CRISPR is that you can't use CRISPR technology merely on a shot in the dark probabilistic guess, right? You actually could you? Okay. Well, let's go into it. Let's go into it then.
You wouldn't. Okay. So you wouldn't do it to your own child on a shot in the dark.
well, let's get into. Okay, so. First off, CRISPR stands, if I recall, for clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeat. Yeah, I'm always forgetting that. It is. Some people have hailed it as the greatest scientific revolution since ever.
It's certainly been marketed as such.
It's been marketed as okay, so that's good. We're going to approach this with a bit of caution. Why would you say, Tane Callan? Why would you say it's been marketed that way? Just curious.
I think for the same reason the Human Genome Project was marketed. I mean, it's a lot of people's it's the interest in the field, it's the livelihood of the people involved, and it is an exciting new technology allowing for transgenesis, with a specificity and like an ease of use that we didn't have before.
Could you just, I understand, but can you explain to the audience what transgenesis is? Because you've used the term. I mean, assume the audience
I'm
are
sorry.
laypeople.
I'm really sorry. Please do have me explain any technical terms. Transgenesis is the introduction of a foreign gene element into the host system. So if I want to get a gene either from another person or another thing into a different host, the modifications that I make to it and the mechanism that I use to deliver it, that is the process of transgenesis.
Right. Okay. CRISPR has been marketed as the great hope, but it seems to be, based on my limited understanding of how it works. First, it was discovered, if I recall, by some people researching bacterial immune systems, right?
That's correct.
And they discovered this, I think, protein, CRISPR-Cas9, that is used as a defense against viruses that invade the bacteria.
That's right.
And they then realized that this could have applications outside of this specific bacterium or these bacteria. And it could be used as a kind of genetic laser, in the same sense that these bacteria would use to defend against viruses. You could use CRISPR technology to target RNA sequences, I believe, and change them. Or correct me if I'm making mistakes here.
So CRISPR-Cas9, it's not anything I've ever worked with. I reviewed it, obviously, in the in the literature, but I believe it binds DNA.
Binds DNA,
if I'm not mistaken.
Right. And the idea is that you can sort of precisely alter aspects of the genome in a way, well, this has never been possible before, other than, selective breeding, maybe, but that's not very precise now, is it?
No.
In a way that, again, never has existed before. And you can do it in terms of germline editing, which would then produce hereditary effects, or not.
That's right.
Or not germline editing, in which case it would just be limited to that particular organism or human being. I mean, it seems based on the. I think. Well, I don't know if we've even explained. I'm the interested layperson. Perhaps you would want to explain in greater detail what CRISPR is, in case it's not been sufficient, the explanation.
I believe it is. It's so like you said, it's derived originally from yeast, I believe,
Yeah.
as a mechanism of undoing what genetic alterations viral DNA might have made. If you don't know, viruses, and especially this is evident in eukaryotes and not in prokaryotes as often, which the things like CRISPR-Cas9 are responsible for in part, which is those prokaryotes tend to optimize their genomes, whereas viral and viruses integrate themselves in. And so eukaryotic DNA is some large part. I don't remember the percentage offhand, but a large part of our DNA is just the remnants of viruses, which either deposit themselves and fail to extract, or on purpose repeatedly deposit themselves within our genome. And it's called in prokaryotes, you would have fewer remnants of that because they have systems of removing that DNA, because there's a constant evolutionary reason they would not want that information. It slows their replication, takes energy they don't want to spend on maintaining themselves. Anyway, CRISPR is essentially I don't know if I want to go too much into it, because it's not exactly something I'm an expert on.
Well, that's fine. I mean, I'm not even.
I was just explaining generally what the evolutionary reason, something that might exist.
I can cite the descriptions used by the people who created it. I'm trying to remember their names, which I can't off the top of my head, but sort of described as a kind of genetic scalpel. Where
I think that's right. I think it's it's comparable to the use of like a more temporary measure like RNAi. Which is basically used to interfere with. Remember when I said that RNA is kind of DNA's way of expressing itself when it needs to go do things out in the world?
Yeah.
When it's going to go do those things, the strands that it sends out of the nucleus would be, in a eukaryote, would be mRNA. Same in a prokaryote. And RNAi is basically antisense, basically, against the code that an mRNA has, so that it's the same thing but like mirrored, right? And what it does is it binds this mRNA as a form of regulation on its expression, and when it's bound, it can't be read by the translation mechanisms, and that means it can't be expressed. The endonuclease activity of Cas9, as I understand it, can be used similarly, but at a DNA level, so that you would not have the messengers in the first place.
Yeah, and that's my understanding. And I think, and I don't know if you've been following this, or correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the past year or so, the first use of it was approved in the United States for some sort of rare blood disease. I'm not sure about that. I'm trying to remember now. But yeah.
I've heard reports of same.
Yeah. So, and one thing I predicted years ago, not specifically with respect to CRISPR, but with genetic technology, is that it almost certainly was first going to be used to help people with diseases. But as time goes on and it becomes more affordable, that is, once it reaches the market, if it ever does, I think it's going to be used for, you could say, quote unquote, less important things, cosmetic applications, basically sort of vanity gene editing, as it were. I think that probably, unless they never let it get that far, I don't really know.
Right. I think all of this is kind of speculative. The reaction to CRISPR-Cas9, in a policy sense, could very much determine what future it has in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, and I also think that unless all the traits that people would really want to boost, we're just not there. Now, I'll just take her word for it. Again, I don't remember the lady's name,
the one who interviewed Sam Harris,
she did that. I've listened to other interviews with her as well. Anyway, Sam Harris, not in that particular discussion, I thought it was strange because he was not very. I mean, he's a neuroscientist, but he seemed to be much more. I wouldn't say even optimistic, but much more certain of the prospects.
Naive, very strange.
of the prospects of changing, fundamentally changing ourselves. Whereas what I need to maybe just look her name up so I stop saying what the co-creator, as it were. She seemed much more cautious about how long it's going to take. Although she did, and I think this is the main point, seem to agree that it is just a matter of time.
I feel she was railroaded into that. I think what we do, now that we have a tool, and by the end of this, I doubt it'll be our only tool or the one that we preferentially go to. The way she spoke of it and the way gene technologies are, the intuitiveness of CRISPR-Cas9 is probably overstated. What we'll find is that, in general, the tools we were using beforehand were less intuitive, but that it doesn't mean it's a panacea. And that, her hesitance to agree to what Sam, was wanting her to, speaks to me of a more technical, in-depth knowledge of the limitations of what her system was capable of.
Jennifer Doudna, by the way, that was
Doudna. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, well, I don't want to get too much into Sam Harris, but he in general, he's been completely convinced of the danger of AI, so he's very involved in that. And so your prediction is that there will be better, more refined techniques for gene editing in the future,
or a toolbox of similarly useful things.
Yeah. But either way, it's going to take a long time, and even young people such as yourself might not be able to profit from it directly or otherwise.
Right.
Yeah, and this is the thing. I think that the talk about genes, whether it comes to SNPs, and autosomal DNA, and all the stuff you hear from the alt-right or the far left, and all, it's led, and then CRISPR has led to the people who don't even understand the technology to make wild speculations about all kinds of things.
We basically live in the world of Gattaca now.
Yeah, and you hear these discussions all the time in online forums and Discord and other places about, basically, welcome to Gattaca. We're it's there. We're gonna, if we're not there now, we're there. We're going to be there in a decade or two. I think one thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the gene trait correlations in the next decade or two, certain ones will become more and more clear in time.
They should be, but never rule out the possibility that politics will interfere.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I guess that is kind of the elephant in the room in a lot of ways. A lot of people, well, we've discussed this just now, seem very politically motivated to I guess, pursue or understand genetics to a certain degree. I'm sure you're familiar with alternative hypothesis. Now, I'm not going to doubt the guy is knowledgeable about the things he's investigated, but it's his motivation which seems
suspect.
Yeah. He doesn't strike me as the guy who's really just trying to understand how genes work, whether they're statistical inferences or not. Then you get on the other hand, speaking of Sam Harris, I think it was inevitable this might come up. He had I don't know how much you listened to him, but he had a discussion very recently, last week or two, with a guy named Ezra Klein, who is a senior editor at Vox magazine. And
I heard the discussion discussed. I haven't listened to it yet, but I do follow Sam Harris. If you can get through it,
I had a friend, I told the person, I said, it's kind of amusing, and this particular person suffers from what some people call secondhand embarrassment, so they couldn't really get through it. But I actually did get through it. It was basically Sam Harris, as I actually predicted this to Flim Flam. In fact, I said Sam Harris is going to bang his head against the wall with him, and that's what happened. But essentially, it was Sam Harris saying, in some cases, he actually said, "Now you can look at me and tell I'm not Korean, right? I mean, do you think, Ezra? Do you think that that people are different?" And his response was, "I don't think we've done nearly enough in this country to combat racism and the historical biases." And it wasn't even the question, right? And he just would repeat it, and it was just back and forth. So, but there you go. On the left, there's this fear that the discovery of differences, which is kind of retarded because everyone knows that people are different. You go out in the street and you see people with long hair and frazzly hair and bald people and tall people and short people and blue-eyed people and green-eyed people and olive-skinned people and pale white people and they're all out there. So you see that people are different, right? And the left solution, or this guy's solution, is to just say that it doesn't exist or it's not real. Okay, that doesn't seem very helpful because if it's observable, people are going to bring up these observable differences for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you have people who want to home in on these differences, and I just don't know. Well, let's be frank here. I'm not sure how important group differences are. That's my honest view. I know that on average there are mean differences, but again, getting back to the earlier point, I don't know how consequential they are for the individual, and I don't even know if there could or should be policy implication. I just don't know.
Right. I think something to touch on is that if we're studying like a complex polygenic trait, that it may be helpful. This is kind of it's not to say that these group differences are based entirely on things that are only in these groups, but if we're going to study something like intelligence, it might be helpful to focus on like a particular group so that we know with some certainty that the inheritance of certain traits had to do with the the culmination of what we view as the trait intelligence. So, for example, a study out of Mensa, or partially funded by them, I don't know, it was referenced to me and I was reading it over, and what they decided to do in their study, which found, I believe, 56% heritability of intelligence from autosomal DNA, excluding the impossibility of studying the maternal contribution to that, which I could explain, but it's very tangential. What this study did was it focused on primarily people who have their roots in Scotland, and that was, I think, and also some of the more intense computational technologies I mentioned earlier, different patterns you can recognize within the genome to do with inheritance, and then also the trait analysis, and then these things in conjunction with one another to find the trait intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not. I think that would be useful. I think it long term be useful to understand.
I guess if I could, the point I was making there is that there may be on a group level different underlying correlates of intelligence, and certainly when we go to discover intelligence, we find that it's the case that if we make the group, if we focus on a particular group, it's easier to find the trait. It may be the case, or it may not be, that this is not a coincidence.
Yeah, and again, I personally don't see the harm in studying, groups of people to figure out what traits may or may not be in greater prevalence there, or what combination of genes lead to certain traits. Mm-hmm. But I think there would be huge political pushback there, and I'm not sure if you could conduct that type of study without people automatically assuming that you're politically motivated and for all the wrong reasons.
Exactly, which is why it's doubtful. It's not doubtful whether or not we could have these answers, or whether or not we could have the application of these technologies in ways that we are similar to what you might envision in the Gattaca version of the world, but it's going to be practically limited by the people in power and what they're how they're forced to view the world. When we're talking about anything that comes from an institution these days, or a business, or anything like that, it's usually the sterilized version of the world where we are pretending to not see differences between people, and that informs our policy to some degree as well. And you'll see that in how we progress, whether or not it's possible.
Well, and I think it's strange because in recent years, one thing I paid attention to is that there's not much worry about discussing differences that may lead to different outcomes in athletic performance. Are you familiar with Actin 3?
Actin 3?
So
I'm generally aware, but like Actin 3, it sounds like you're going into a deeper tangent.
not really. Well, I mean, long story short, Actin 3 it's basically a protein, and it is associated, or its lack of expression sometimes, as it's pointed out, is associated with greater athletic performance, specifically explosive sprinting, things like that.
Okay.
And it is, then there's a mutation where there's a deficiency of that sometimes, and particular effects, without going into details, result in, again, greater athletic performance, and it seems to be more that West Africans have this in greater prevalence. Now, nobody really has an issue. There have been articles written about this, but nobody cares about that. It's really the things above the neck. Because it was a tangent. I didn't want to talk. It was just to show an example of something that is reasonably well known, reasonably well understood, but people don't care about it much. That above, sort of the below the neckline, above the neckline thing, that people care most about that. Again, I've talked about this before on my channel. Actually discovering things that are inferred by you could say, economic and socioeconomic distributions you see in society. For example, that generally speaking, East Asians tend to be in the upper echelons of quote-unquote success, say in North America, the United States, in terms of income brackets, etc. That, these are correlations that make sense, that you could just infer. And if we were to discover, I don't know, that Koreans or whatever, there are these correlations, and that wouldn't be shocking, really. In fact, all it would do is confirm what we already know. And then personally, and this is a matter of opinion, because then it's a policy thing, that I'm all for just letting the chips fall where they may. I don't think we will ever have the capacity to re-engineer the world the way the left wants to see it. And I think putting arbitrary restrictions on people can also lead to harm, which is, I guess you could say, more be a right-wing policy. Whoever's good at whatever just should be able to do that, I think. And any discoveries made along the way, to me at least, are just, they'll confirm things we already know. It's like I was saying before, when I got a couple of health reports, and you're bald. Oh, wow, I didn't know that. Things like that. I already knew that. So it wasn't very surprising, basically. And what I'm saying is that anything we might discover will probably correspond to things we can already observe and have observed for decades. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
My thoughts are that, if it could entirely be the case that these discoveries are unharmful in that way to anyone looking on, but it could also be the case that particularly people with a left-wing ideology might rely on the assumption that everyone might be a blank slate, and if we were to discover that things are heritable from essentialist from the genes, more if that's more the case for certain traits that especially have to do with socio-economic status, more and more they would find that their views are out of favor with the current scientific paradigms.
Right. But one thing that Sam Harris was pointing out in that discussion was that, and I'm almost quoting him, it's more of a paraphrase, but that going forward, we're all going to be continually blindsided by different discoveries. As he points out, virtually everything we care about has some genetic component to it, so we're just going to discover these things. I don't, and I don't disagree that the left, in particular, we already know the left's game. I think as somebody who's kind of not politically aligned, I tend to be more concerned about what the right's game would be concerning this stuff. Would they want to fundamentally alter policies? I'm all for getting rid of affirmative action if that's all they want to do. But they want to take it further. It's impossible to tell.
Well, left or right, anyone who's an ideologue looking at this problem doesn't really care about just the answer that they get. It's how they might use it.
Yeah, and this is my concern. It seems that you can definitely argue that the scientific method and the people involved, you don't strike me as really, I don't know if you do, but you don't strike me as being very political.
I'm political, just not outwardly opinionated.
I see. Okay, but you don't, for whatever reason, you don't let your politics really affect the science you do.
Hmm.
That's my assumption, at least.
That's right.
Right. You're not trying to re-engineer the world. So you didn't. You're not trying. You're not pursuing genetics to accomplish some grand vision, political vision, basically. And so, everyone's going to have a political opinion. I mean, obviously, because we're just political animals. But the thing is that it's one thing to do the science, and then it's another thing to really just to use your politics either to make use of the results or to just kind of intermix your politics with what you're actually doing and trying to accomplish.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, what do you think? I mean, I'd say overall, I'm more concerned about the left than I am the right, because it's
who's in power, from my view.
Yeah, they're stifling the conversation. I think that this obsession with race and, I guess, to some degree genetics has driven people mad, to the point where they can't even think straight. In fact, I've had some friendships fall apart because of it. And so I guess I would say, yeah, I'm more worried about the left. But if and when the pendulum swings back, who knows what the right might want to do with this stuff. It's just I'm kind of concerned about both sides, although at the moment it's obviously the left. I just don't know. I don't really think we need to do anything with necessarily with these discoveries, because they're just going to confirm things we could already observe. Right? I think. If we could,
I guess I just think it could go any way that anybody would want to take it.
Well, what way would you like to take it if it were up to you?
I really do see I guess I don't really want to talk too much about inside baseball, but where things are going with this talk based on how we've laid it out ahead of time. What I was going to talk about is a bit of the where we're going. Mm-hmm. And I think that the way we'll develop the science will kind of leave things open to after the fact interpretation, kind of like what you'd see with the quantitative analysis, implicating certain genes. And I think more and more as the science, the field develops, we'll just have information that anyone can take in whichever way that they'd like. We'd kind of have an overabundance of it, and it would be up to whoever's got the public's attention to direct that direct that interest, basically.
Right. The data stand on their own. The data exist on their own, and it's always a matter of human interpretation and what people want to do with it. But again, from my perspective, we don't.
It's hard to protect. I guess I'm trying to say it's hard to protect basically political opinions from enacting non-political data, with that, what it will. It's going to be whoever's in charge, what their political views are, the data are going to be used to confirm that.
Yeah, fair enough. For the time being, it seems to be the left, and they deny even the existence of these data. But so that's kind of, I'd say, probably even should be the main concern of people who are interested in this topic and how people are politicizing it. But I guess you could envision a world as well where the right somehow got power and went nuts with it as well, too. No?
Oh, of course. I just don't think that the right might push for certain types of data being acquired that we don't currently have, which might have policy implications if we had it.
But what would the policy implications be? I mean, let's say, everyone thinks I'm some sort of frothy in the mouth raving racist by now anyway, so I suppose it doesn't matter. But let's say, we talk about some of these population differences. And it turns out that, there's some, after years of study, we just know rather firmly that on average, certain populations, there's no speculation anymore, it's almost non-existent, differ in terms of IQ or G or whatever we want to term it. The policy implications wouldn't be any different than they've ever been, because again, people are smart, whatever group they come from, tend to do better than people who aren't smart. I don't really see what we need to do with that necessarily. Unless
Well, it
wanna,
might change like the number of people. Well, how we redistribute wealth, how we let people in, how we how firm our standards are. Like once you know, you can't go back to not knowing. What kind of Pandora's box you might be unleashing on your genetic population, depending on how authoritarian you might be. You would you might look at these things like certain propensity to genetic disease or things that we discover are like isolated to certain populations, whether or not you would want them introduced. Maybe something to do with immunity or something like that down the line, like certain characteristics that you might favor or disfavor on a population level.
well,
The government might take a look at.
we've already seen echoes of this. I was just discussing earlier today with some people that there's a group of quote unquote Asian American students who are suing Harvard because of discrimination.
Yes.
Yeah, and they, they're claiming, I think rightly so, that Harvard has different standards for them, and Harvard's denying it. And I think all of this just points to the obvious that, yeah, on average, they tend to do better than other groups. And, okay, their quotas and diversity quotas and what have you. I think a lot of it, maybe not everything, but a lot of what we know would just be confirmed. And maybe you're right. Maybe if it's spelt out to everybody and it's in block letters as opposed to inferred based on socioeconomic observations or something like that, maybe then it would be that much worse and people would flip their lids. And of course, I mean, anyone could design any type of policies. But I think the critical issue here is we have to figure out some way of how people can, in a balanced and fair manner, deal with human difference in general and perhaps even group differences. Although I know people like to make fun of me like with individualism, but I do try to. I'm just that way. I try to treat people as an individual on an individual basis. I don't. Generally speaking, I don't encounter someone and say, "Oh, you're part of that group." I figured it all out. If I want to interact with that person, so there must be some way we can proceed that will, allow us to do the interesting research and maybe even important research, because I think it is important to understand what the basis of intelligence is and what have you. But without it being infected by either various left-wing views or right-wing views per se, that would really push things in the wrong policy direction.
Well, I think it's certainly a possibility, but as I've already expressed, I think the views of the people who are ultimately in charge of directing and investigating the data already existing will kind of have their say over what the research is and will be, and that as much as it might be possible to exist in this purely scientific sense, it'll always be an extension of the politics of the day.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's possible, but also not possible.
Yeah. I think, and it certainly will be. We're not going to be the people. Well, maybe you will. I don't know. Maybe you'll be the one determining policy, but I'm certainly, I'm not going to be anyone determining.
You're on your way out.
Well, yeah, I'm going to be dead in a couple of years, so it's kind of, I guess, somewhat irrelevant. But
well, hopefully not before the Elder Scrolls 6.
Yeah, well, I am kind of making it a point to survive until then. It's just, at the rate Bethesda's going, who knows? I might not make it. But, yeah, I think that, it might be on younger people to figure this out. And the thing that concerns me is that it's really the young people that seem the most polarized one way or another. The people who are frothing at the mouth, whether it's left or right, are those types of people. And if I'm frank, they seem to be the least informed and the least willing to really investigate and concede certain things, based on my, I guess, superficial observations of that generation. And it's alarming to me, because going forward, these are the people who are going to be quote unquote in charge, right? But they're not taking the time to actually learn about the things that could have potentially long-standing consequences for society and the world. It's well, again, in many ways, it's not my wheelhouse because I'm on my way out. But I mean, are you at all concerned, or do you just only focus on the science?
Oh, I mean, I'm concerned. You look where you met me. It's just,
Yeah.
I don't know. I've kind of given up hope that, like, it'll ever be, just for the science. I just, I hope that it doesn't ever. Obviously, I just don't want to be somebody's political tool.
Yeah, but that seems inevitable. Fact is, matter of fact, in that conversation with, and you could learn something from that Sam Harris Ezra Klein conversation, because however misguided he is, and I'll take him at his word that he actually believes the stuff he's saying. This Ezra Klein character, I mean, he was just really, really worried about the implications in terms of policy of the things that Charles Murray has talked about. And I can, it's somewhat understandable, especially if you're on your left and you think that wealth redistribution is the best thing ever and affirmative action is great. Okay.
I don't think all of the currently existing popular ideological understandings of the world can exist in the light of the data which might come out. Not all of it will be, equally corroborating of every worldview.
Yeah, but again, I just look at the world and it's obvious that people are different, have different aptitudes, and I always bring up this example, but 75%
you talk about believing people at their word, and there are many people, like you said, of Ezra Klein's persuasion, which will insist that they don't see the world in this way.
Yeah, but so again, 75% of the NBA is black. I'm not upset about that. I don't see too many people upset about that either. But
what if you weren't allowed to know what the count of people are in the NBA?
Well, for some reason, people aren't particularly secretive about that.
Well, I mean, as the technology progresses, maybe we'll have less. What's it called? We'll have a less mysterious, analog in genomic technologies.
Yeah, possibly. Huh. So in some sense, you're a bit resigned about the future. And perhaps not in doing the research and pursuing your work, but in the political sphere, at least, you're a bit...
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you never know what might happen, but again, the way things are going, despite what Sargon of Akkad might, trumpet to the world, I don't think the left has been defeated or what have you. Matter of fact, I've recently did a discussion on sperm banks and their consequences that was demonetized.
I was listening to that. Was demonetized. That was a great talk.
Yeah, it was demonetized. And the interesting thing is, usually if a video is not I want to say usually, many times, if a video is demonetized, you can submit it to consideration. And it was confirmed by a manual review, meaning that whoever manually reviewed it did not like that material. I had another video that I made years ago about the biochemistry of synthetic testosterone and how it interacts with the male reproductive system. And I stated in that video, something that's factual, that prolonged administration of synthetic testosterone tends to downregulate the endogenous production of testosterone in the body. It's pretty much all I was saying. This video is 60 years old, and it actually earned me a community strike. So now, if I wanted to, I couldn't stream.
Why is that? I know.
I think they claim I was endorsing drug use. Maybe, I'm not sure.
What?
Yeah, I don't know. So it's I don't even know what types of videos are appropriate. I mean, I know things I definitely should not put in titles and talk about, but I thought a discussion about sperm banks would be interesting, and I didn't think that would call for demonetizing. But again, there were some critical opinions expressed there, obviously, because I do think it interferes with certain types of selection, sexual selection. But I guess they didn't like that. I have no idea. But it seems the direction things are going in really is such that it's not that the left hasn't been defeated. We're walking on eggshells more and more. And I find it, I just don't even know where to stand anymore, because where we met, for example, I don't actually know what your politics are. It's not really relevant, but you seem to be a pretty balanced person every time I've interacted with you. part when you're ripping heads off as Widowmaker, but that's a separate issue. Game I've retired from, hopefully. The thing is that a lot of people who spend time in those circles aren't there because they really even want to be there. It's just there's just no other place to go, even socially. So when you're done with your work, where do you go? Well, everyone is some sort of frothing at the mouth, not even leaning, left-wing maniac who's going to breathe down your neck about everything. And then in those circles, well, you know what you can get there. So I don't know. And then because the only way you can really go, not that I really consider myself right, is just to move in circles that are characterized as more right, you'll get lumped in with them anyway, which is what has happened to me. I mean, you've heard me speak. I've seen people in various places on the internet and YouTube call me a alt-right white supremacist racist. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it kind of fits. I mean, even having the discussion, I'm not saying it fits, but I'm saying to the person who's describing you as such, it fits because within their worldview, what they would discuss, face to face, or with these people who are not necessarily anonymous, people who are existing within social media as it was intended to, or as it seems to be increasingly the case, intended to be used. Not anonymously, and very much in favor of kind of a pro-corporate progressive worldview. You would you would see more and more that the things that you want to discuss or are interested in are just.
Well, I realize that, but even people that aren't in those circles are I've noticed just kind of suffering from a kind of moral or just a general confusion, where their ability to listen to what people are actually saying has been shut down.
Because they're not hearing it, one side or the other. The discussion's not being had, and they get, they have intense emotions about it in general.
Yeah.
Because it's for lack of exposure, I would say. And so, not to say that you are, those things that you're being labeled, but you have those things inside of you, like you do, anything you understand or come to understand, both sides of. You're more in that direction because, for lack of being absent an opinion on those things.
Yeah, I tend to be very non-aligned, and I think in today's atmosphere, if you don't take a strong position on something, people will have, unfortunately, I don't know why, because you could just listen, the flexibility of shoehorning you in any bucket they want to. And that's definitely been my experience. I do think that I at least some of my subscribers are discerning and people I know, but I'm not a particular fan of the alt-right, and anyone who actually listens to me knows that. I'm certainly not a fan of the current iteration of the left. I kind of just have my own views and I maintain them, but yeah, I think it's inevitable in today's atmosphere that you'll get shoehorned in one corner or the other. But I guess there's nothing you can do in such a situation. It would be
nothing to convince the YouTube censor that you're not.
Well, not just the YouTube censor, but people in general.
Yeah.
We're living. That's the strangest thing. Maybe it's because I'm so old, but I don't remember just everyone existing in a specific category that you would just 20 years ago, and you would just chuck them in there, and you would just move on. But that's the way it works on the internet in particular. Everyone belongs to a category, and if you don't, someone will put you there. It doesn't really matter, right?
Well, I mean, you can be purposefully apolitical, and then it's a large event, like a community dividing event, if you say, any one thing at all, and then half your audience evaporates.
Yeah. I've seen, even having an interest, that's the thing I've noticed over the last couple of years, having any interest in genetics seems to some, obviously some people just to be, by implication, me expressing or supporting views of, say, the alt-right or racism or whatever. Whereas to be honest, I'm just kind of interested in stuff. I'm not somebody really looks at things with the idea of what can we do with this to reshape the world necessarily. I'm interested in this stuff because it's just kind of interesting to me. But exploring certain issues, obviously for most people pushing it. I can understand your reluctance to, you don't seem, you seem to want to avoid these classifications too, understandably. But yeah, I don't really see a good solution, and because everyone wants to pigeonhole you these days. And even having a discussion about the basics of this stuff, well, I actually guarantee there'll be probably people leaving comments calling me a racist or whatever. I'm almost expect it.
Still, after all this time?
Oh, yeah. There's an irony to it, too, because the people who come on my channel about racism tend to be, I guess you could classify them as black supremacists who are, talking about the how Whitey's going to get killed or something. I have no taste for it.
And how did they get turned on to you?
Well, they used to like me when I only talked about reproduction and biology in terms of men and women, and when I expanded my horizons, they decided that I was a quote-unquote racist. So, yeah, that's kind of, again, you have these buckets, right? And if you decide to pick up an extra bucket or two, instead of just being in the one bucket, then people tend to go nuts. And I guess you have to just take it in stride and accept it with grace, as gracefully as you can. But I'm not a very passionate person about really anything, so I'm not really looking to push anything. I think what bothers me, say, about the genetic stuff is there's just a lot of misinformation out there, which is why I wanted to have this talk with someone who actually does the work in the field, and maybe learn a little bit myself, and hopefully the audience learns something too. And not get misled by all the popular junk out there, which is not really fact checked. And you've probably seen it. I've seen some pretty crazy statements made about genetics and all kinds of weird stuff.
I think there was I think it was Vox, the outlet. Somebody shared me a particularly bad clip from them. There's not like a racism gene or something like that, and entirely serious. I don't have it offhand, and I don't know the title of the video, but I remember having a good, long laugh at that one. And, any other example that you can come up with. I mean, Kraut's videos were peppered with all kinds of little, gaffes like that come out of the alt-right. So it's not, one side or the other that's speaking ignorantly, kind of speaking to the theme.
That's the problem. It's both sides. I saw something the other night where this person was just spouting off about the implication of Iberian genes, whatever the hell that means. Okay, and that was, you could guess what kind of person that was. So, and it drives me crazy. I think that's the thing that drives me most crazy is misrepresentation and misinformation. And there's just so much of it out there that at the very least what we can do is try to maybe clarify some things and be reasonably informative. So if people really do want to understand something, then they can look into it. But I definitely don't see most people wanting to do that. And to be honest, I'll just say this publicly. I'm sick to death about talking about race. That's all I hear these days. It's boring. It's just boring. To me, it's boring by now. Because and what is it? Yeah, different populations.
Well, I think
people are different.
Well, yeah. To a certain degree, I think it's it comes up more than it ought to in the corners where people are willing to discuss it, and hence the association with racism. And then you have people moving in who are racists. Into these communities where you are allowed to have the discussion. It's all of the interest, all of the the heated opinions kind of get forced into the corner where it can exist. And so people who stick around, who are in these communities, probably don't want to hear it as much because we're kind of taking on the interest of everybody else who's been forced in. Yeah,
I mean, I don't like those types of people because I don't share their views on many things, but you get there's no other place to go, and this enters the realm of politics too. For example, I think anyone who thinks that there should, immigration should be completely free and there should be no restriction. They're insane, left or right. But the only people who talk about that sort of thing tend to be, at the very least, right, in some cases far, far right. So
and on the left, I mean, just the other day I was watching a live stream from a large YouTuber, actually, where he was expressing his views very much, in favor of what you said, like open borders and the progression towards a new humanity. I'm not going to name who, but, that's out there.
Well, right. So you have certain topics that are really only in the province of certain circles of people, some of whom actually are racist, some of whom aren't. I wouldn't say I am. Well, people can discern that for themselves. You don't seem that way. But there are only a couple of areas of the internet where you can discuss things like genetics. But it always has that flavor, right? It's not just, oh, this is interesting. Let's talk about CRISPR. Let's talk about autosomal DNA. Even I don't know when it'll come out. I've been working on and off a video about haplotypes and this discovery in England, the Cheddar Man, and
oh yeah.
I'm not going to spoil too many of the details, but basically it was completely politicized and to the point where they were outright lying about. I don't want to go into the details. I'll just say that there are different populations in Europe at the time. And this is kind of my best area of genetics, the sort of prehistoric stuff. And by the time that particular population was probably neither quote unquote black nor white, because the alleles responsible for decreased skin pigmentation had not been sufficiently spread by then. So he was probably like an olive skin guy, but they published him as black as hell, which was also not true. But he wasn't really white. He in actuality, but nobody cares about how it was. They just, you had the left publishing this in major newspapers saying, oh, you see, he was black, and I don't even know why that's important. A 10,000-year-old bunch of.
Well, I think that actually segs very nicely, if this isn't stepping on your toes too much with the other subject matter of your upcoming video. With like kind of a naive view of genetics, if something like a Cheddar Man exists and he's black, to the in the eyes of like lay people, especially politically motivated lay people, you might report on that saying, see, look, it's just like, these other melanated people, right?
Totally. There are a couple of things, and I won't be spoiling too much because the video will have a lot more details. But one, the early, once human beings started leaving, I know there's contention about that, but human beings left Africa. The very, very dark skin tone we see in many modern African populations was actually a later genetic mutation.
This is what I was going into.
Yeah. It wasn't the case. And the lesser pigmentation tended... So there are two... When we talk about prehistoric Europe, we're really talking about in two populations. A population that largely disappeared, that existed before, and then a population that some people refer to as the Indo-Europeans. They go over different names, different cultures, and they're often correlated in terms of alleles with this sort of import of paler skin. But again, the population that existed 10, 15,000 years ago, by the lights of my research, almost certainly was sort of olive skin, darkish, but they weren't white, and they definitely weren't black. And the most important observation to make here, in my opinion, is who cares? I mean, who honestly cares about the way? I mean, apart from the interest. Oh, that's interesting. My paternal ancestor originated in the Caucasus 35,000 years ago. Should I pack my bags and move there? Because I don't really care, and I don't see why it's even relevant in a modern sense that the Cheddar Man was probably some olive skin guy. Or not.
Your understanding of genetics is that skin color equals like every other trait, and and it's beneficial for you to say, hey, you white person, you're related to this person who was melanated a certain way, and if you look like that, then you're just like this other person, and so on and so on. It really does kind of stem from a lack of education and the desire to politicize, the data where they might support your worldview. So,
well, and this is what annoys me, because when you get something like The Guardian putting out these articles, it's just Joe Schmo reading it. They're not going to look into
writing it for that matter.
into the details. I mean, my interest in sort of haplotypes, I had a lot of a background in studying linguistics back in the day, and sort of related to that. So I studied these Indo-European populations, and later I learned that, a lot of the alleles that we associate with lighter skin came from later waves than the original Neolithic population, or Mesolithic, you could say, before that. So, and the various cultures associated with, like, Yamna and corded ware, people aren't going to look in there and say, they just accept it at face value. And then you get people on the alt-right who think it matters whether or not 10,000 years ago a guy was black or not. I don't think... yes, you can infer political implications, but it's not I don't think it's terribly important. We're talking about not even pre-ancient history here. So it's interesting from a historical anthropological point of view, but and the story of changes in skin pigmentation is interesting because it corresponds with more northern latitudes and things like vitamin D and et cetera, et cetera. But that's just sort of scientifically interesting. I don't really see why it has. Well, I understand why, but again, this is who has control of the narrative, and then the need to push back in equally politically motivated tones. That's what bothers me. So anyway, it's a bit of a rant there, but the whole that story annoyed me, and some of the responses annoyed me on both sides. So.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something I just brought up. A lot of people don't know that very dark skin tone was a later development.
Well, we're a sexually reproducing species is kind of what I might add to that is, and that is to say, your population doesn't all of a sudden come to the conclusion that and all at once mutate that their skin will be white. It's it shouldn't be like a huge revelation to anyone that a population exists as like a set of alleles that exist in greater or lesser frequencies, and it's the generational turning over and recalculation or recalibration really of these allele
genetic
frequencies,
drift,
which defines them.
Genetic drift,
which is equally responsible for the idiosyncrasies found within each population.
Precisely, and so but people don't want to look into that, and it just seems. It seems to me like the basics aren't that hard to understand, yet people still don't want to make an effort regarding that. And it's a shame. It must be very frustrating to you as a geneticist. I'm just an interested layperson, but because you must be, presumably you still have your hair on like me. You must be pulling your you're youngin'. You must be pulling your hair out every time you listen to some of these moronic discussions about genetics.
I don't know. It's always fun, to analyze maybe where they might be going wrong. But at a certain point, when you're dealing with lay people, it doesn't really make much sense to think about what they're saying in a technical sense. Other than where I can pragmatically relate it to reality, I just try and take it as it is as a political stance, like whether or not generally they find themselves as more essentialist or tabula rasa. And kind of go from there. I can suppress my desire to step in and say, well, actually,
that's an interesting way of approaching it. So essentialist in the sense that sort of genes are everything, at least that view, which is of course incorrect. They're very important, but there obviously is the nature of evolution is that there's a genetic template, and there's an environmental input, and so that's how we evolve.
Right.
But I'd say that there is a lot of essential. I know I have incorrectly been classified as essentialist, but then we've been over that. People hear what they want to hear, and tabula rasa. Well, we did have that. You bore witness to that. The guy who didn't even understand heritability, seemingly. So
He's an odd case. Very
yeah.
much celebrated within his peer group, though.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
Oh
that.
yeah. Oh, sorry. After the fact, he went back and had a little party. He had like a hero's welcome back at his his place of origin. If you didn't know.
Oh, okay. Well, I what for steadfastly resisting the idea that eye color might be heritable.
Precisely. I wish I were kidding.
I I'm not going to lie. I do wish for saner times. It seems that all the we kind of, in some sense, live in the most interesting time period possible, specifically with regards to genetics and all the things we're learning about our origins as a species, and then, on the other hand, the most insane because we're not really well equipped to deal with it in a reasonable manner. But I guess it's credit to you that you've been able to sort of modulate your interaction with these people to sort of just a sort of baseline political. Are they blank slate? Are they essentialist? Yeah, something like that. I guess
Yeah.
that makes sense. But I imagine that both kind of drive you crazy in some sense.
Like I said, I've shut down a lot of. Maybe it's because I'm not very hopeful that that I don't really care, whether or not somebody's getting it right technically all the time, and I just seek to categorize the view and address it, where it's coming from.
Yeah, well, I share your loss of hope on many fronts, but not to the point where I want to do nothing. I mean, the whole point of
Oh, of
having this
course.
conversation was that maybe some people can learn something if or further investigate, and even if they don't, maybe they'll learn a little bit about genetics and not walk away completely ignorant or just sort
I
of
mean, it's more accessible than ever. I'm not going to say which my account is, but like the universities have us, working on and providing like sources for the Wikipedia pages, more than ever, and in increasing amounts, you have rare information, new information being made publicly available, and all from people who are doing it, purely out of the passion of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But again, all that will be either be ignored or politically hijacked by take your pick, which is a real shame. I'm wondering if there can't be some movement that that counteracts both. But
For now, I've seen obviously there's a lot of politicking on the main pages in Wikipedia, but if you're looking for specific technical information on stuff that's being and you can expect it to be relatively good. Look at the talk pages on those Wikipedia and those Wikipedia sources. I've seen ones where I've corrected it, where they're based on information that's been retracted, stuff like that. But for the most part, it's good, and you can rely on it. So if you want to know more, it's out there for you.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that definitely that's been my experience. The little I know about genetics has been self-taught over the years, and I still try to learn when I can. And because my background, as everyone probably knows by now, is not in that field, but yeah, it's all there. But again, it's the eternal internet dilemma where people just don't even want to bother.
Mm-hmm.
It's the kind of I've encountered a couple of these, especially recently, where they read a sentence or two on Wikipedia and then they're experts on whatever it might be. Man, those people, there are a lot of them, believe me. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I think this was a great opportunity to just listen and learn a little about genetics with people who are unaware and talk about some of the other aspects, the political ones, without necessarily being political ourselves about it, but just down the line. But I think on a final note, if our resident geneticist here has lost hope with regards to reasonable discussion on these matters, that should be very alarming to anyone who hears that, because it really tells you about the state of affairs. Anyway, and would you like to add anything?
No, not unless you had any other questions.
No,
It's
no,
been
I
a
think
pleasure being on.
Yeah, no, it's been my pleasure to have you on. And thanks for joining me, and thank you, audience, for tuning in. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.